San Bruno, California, a quiet suburb located 11 miles southwest of San Francisco. It was here in September 2010 that a tragic accident would bring devastation to the small community of 41,000 residents and would raise questions that may take years to fully answer. Running beneath the streets of Crestmore, a quiet middle-class neighborhood in San Bruno, was a 2.5-foot wide, 47-mile-long natural gas transmission pipeline. The pipe was operated by the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, or PG&E, and was designated as Line 132. This small, tight-knit community is far from unique. Across the United States, there are about 300,000 miles of gas transmission pipeline that traverse urban, suburban, and rural areas. And just as in other places around the country, many of the residents in San Bruno didn't even know the pipe was there. That would change in an instant. Early in the evening on Thursday, September 9th, most residents of San Bruno were likely returning from work or sitting down to dinner. Then, at 6:11 p.m., a sudden, deafening bang shook the town. The sound came from Line 132 as the pipeline burst open beneath the intersection of Earl Avenue and Glenview Drive. The high pressure inside the pipe caused a geyser of natural gas to shoot upwards with incredible force, blowing a giant crater in the center of the intersection. Once above ground, the natural gas ignited, creating a tower of fire that reached more than 300 feet into the sky. Nearby homes and cars burst into flames, and in moments an inferno raged in the heart of this peaceful neighborhood.
I arrived just after the incident occurred, and the frustrating part in the very beginning was the fact that first responders were unable to do a whole lot. We had 400 police and fire personnel there within a few hours through the first 48 hours of the incident. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank them, not just San Mateo County, but the whole Bay Area for the response.
Some 47 million cubic feet of natural gas was released before firefighters extinguished the flames. That's enough to power 1,200 residential homes for 1 year. Tragically, 8 people were killed. Many more were injured. 38 homes were destroyed, and 70 others were damaged. The next day, the National Transportation Safety Board launched a team of pipeline experts to San Bruno to investigate one of the largest pipeline accidents in recent U.S. history.
The National Transportation Safety Board is responsible for investigating transportation accidents to determine probable cause and to make recommendations to prevent the reoccurrence of accidents. Pipelines are a form of transportation in that they carry materials such as gases and liquids. My office, the Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials Investigations, has that responsibility here at the Safety Board.
Upon arriving on scene, investigators began examining the ruptured section of Line 132.
My first impression was the magnitude of the amount of damage done. Whole city blocks were just gone. Houses had been reduced to chimneys and foundations. Maybe a car or two in what used to be the driveway. It looked more like something out of a science fiction movie than what you would expect out of what would have been a very densely populated neighborhood.
NTSB investigators immediately began working to find out why the pipeline had failed. PG&E's records indicated that Line 132 was a seamless, grade X42 pipe, capable of withstanding pressures of up to 400 psi. During the rupture, The pressure in line 132 near the rupture location had spiked to 386 psi, well within the performance specifications for grade X42 pipe. But the ruptured section of pipe that the team found at the scene was very different.
When I arrived at the scene, I was surprised to see a 28-foot long 30-inch pipe blown to about 100 feet away from the crater. The other thing that was visible to me and to everybody present was the presence of a longitudinal seam in that segment of the pipe. Earlier, we were told by PG&E that their records indicate that the pipe was 30-inch seamless, whereas the actual pipe in service had longitudinal seam, which immediately alerted us as to the records that PG&E is keeping and the accuracy of those records. The other thing I also noticed was the presence of very short, small sections of the pipe called pups. That small sections and that closely welded together is also not very common.
After 5 days of gathering data at the accident site, for detailed metallurgical analysis, the team shipped segments of the fractured pipeline to the NTSB's laboratory, located just outside Washington, D.C. In the days and weeks after the San Bruno explosion, there was public outcry and fear as communities nationwide wondered if pipes running beneath their homes could turn their neighborhoods into the next San Bruno.
One of the biggest challenges I faced was when people were understandably asking the question, is it safe for me to go home tonight when I have a pipeline down the middle of my street? I could only answer that by saying, we are not here to make a determination of the overall safety of pipelines. We are here to make a determination of what caused this specific mishap. And my challenge was to maintain credibility as a provider of information when I could not answer that very important question to the local citizenry.
Early in the investigation, identifying problems of oversight and accountability, the NTSB quickly issued a number of urgent safety recommendations to PG&E and to federal and state regulators. These recommendations urged PG&E to immediately test the remainder of its pipeline network for similar weak pipes, and recommended that California state regulators ensure PG&E's compliance. The NTSB also called on the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, an arm of the U.S. Department of Transportation that regulates the pipeline industry, to advise other pipeline operators throughout the country of the circumstances of the San Bruno rupture, so these operators would assess their own systems and take any needed action. The NTSB uncovered serious record-keeping weaknesses at PG&E that could create conditions allowing PG&E pipelines to be operated at higher pressures than the pipes were built to withstand. Additional urgent safety recommendations called on PG&E and California regulators to ensure that the records, surveys, and documents for all pipeline systems correctly reflect PG&E's pipeline infrastructure so that maximum safe operating pressures would be accurately calculated and maintained. In March 2011, 6 months after the San Bruno explosion, the NTSB held a 3-day public hearing to gather additional information. A number of expert witnesses testified. Much of the information gathered at the hearing became crucial to advancing the investigation. After nearly a year of intensive investigation, the NTSB experts were able to piece together the events that led to this tragic accident. During the day on September 9th, the day of the rupture, PG&E personnel were replacing electronic systems at the Milpitas pipeline terminal south of San Bruno.
What happened at Milpitas was a maintenance project where they were going to replace the uninterruptible power supply. And in that process, they were going to install some mini UPSs to some critical components. While the work was being done, somehow the power was lost.
During this maintenance activity, one of the components malfunctioned, causing valves to open, allowing the pressure to increase. The pressure increased to a level of 386 psi, which is the highest recorded level at this location. Because of the poorly constructed pipe, it was unable to maintain this pressure and the pipe ruptured.
10 minutes later, 2 off-duty PG&E employees called in to report a massive fire in San Bruno. 12 minutes after the rupture, the PG&E dispatch center sent an on-duty employee to investigate the reported explosion. That employee, however, was not qualified to operate the mainline valves used to stop the flow of natural gas. Nearly 30 minutes after the rupture, 2 off-duty PG&E mechanics, hearing media reports of the fire, met at a nearby PG&E facility to obtain the tools needed and proceeded to close the valves upstream and downstream of the rupture location to stop the flow of gas at San Bruno. At 7:42 p.m., an hour and a half after the blast, flames at the rupture location began to recede. The fire was soon extinguished, but catastrophic damage had been done. The ruptured section of pipe was of unknown origin, and rigorous testing at the NTSB lab showed that it was poorly fabricated and could only withstand a fraction of the pressure it should have been able to bear.
As soon as we opened the crate and looked at what was inside, it was visually evident that the pipe was not seamless. There were multiple sections of pipe that had type of welding called double submerged arc welds, where the pipe is welded from the outside and on the inside of the pipe. But then there were also these short sections of pipe called pups, and in particular there were 3 where we could see that there was no weld on the inside of the pipe.
The ruptured section neither met the standards of today nor those at the time of its installation more than half a century earlier. Line 132 was first installed in 1948, but in 1956, when Crestmore was being built, the developer found that line 132's position interfered with his designs for the road. At his request, PG&E moved the pipeline.
There's really very little quality control in the 56 project. No radiography of the girth welds, no mechanical tests done of welding materials, and the only thing we saw was maybe a leak test, no pressure test. Of course, it wasn't required back then, but no pressure test on the line, just a leak test, basically a bubble test on the girth welds to make sure they're sealing. So large differences, but we could not ever identify from the paperwork supplied what the source was for those 6 pups.
This poor construction in 1956 directly led to the tragedy in 2010.
The accident was preventable. First and foremost, if PG&E had had an effective quality control program in place at the time of the 1950s relocation project, this poorly fabricated piece of pipe would never have been put into the ground. Secondly, if PG&E had pressure tested the line upon completion of construction, it's likely this inferior piece of pipe would have failed. But PG&E was not required to pressure test the line, and over the years they've chosen not to pressure test the line.
NTSB investigators determined that the rupture occurred along a seam weld in one section of the pipe. From the outside, the weld's appearance was consistent with other welds along the pipe. However, when the interior of the pipe was examined, it became clear that the pipe had not been welded from the inside as required. This meant that the weld penetrated only about halfway through the pipe, whereas other seams on the pipe length were welded from both sides, completely penetrating the pipe. Because of the deficient weld, this pipe was weaker, and when it was exposed to higher than normal pressures as a result of the malfunction at the Milpitas terminal, it ruptured. These findings were reported by the team of investigators at a public meeting of the 5 members of the National Transportation Safety Board in August 2011.
We ultimately determined the cause of this accident was a flawed pipe, flawed operations, and flawed oversight. We know that looking at this accident over a year, that there were a lot of problems that PG&E had, but there were a lot of problems that were not detected by the oversight entity, the California Public Utilities Commission, and also the federal entity, PHMSA, who was responsible for oversight and doing audits of CPUC and doing audits of PG&E.
PG&E's flawed emergency response procedures, which took far too long, contributed to this accident, as did PG&E's lack of automatic shutoff valves. These valves would have allowed company employees to remotely close the pipeline and cut the flow of natural gas at least an hour sooner. They would not have prevented the accident, but automatic shutoff valves would have significantly reduced the seriousness of the damage. To prevent a similar accident from happening again, the NTSB called on PHMSA to require all gas transmission pipeline operators to improve their risk management systems by installing sensors to determine the exact location of a pipeline rupture when it occurs, installing automatic shutoff valves, and running effective audits to routinely test the strength of their pipelines. The NTSB also recommended that PHMSA retract the grandfather clause that excludes the older pipelines from pressure testing. This will ensure that these older pipelines are subject to the same testing requirements as newer pipelines.
I think what we identified in this accident in San Bruno was we had an operator, and the operator was really given a lot of authority to do the right thing. And what we found was that they didn't do the right thing. And so, as Ronald Reagan famously said, it's up to the oversight entity not just to trust, but verify. And what we found with the CPUC and in turn PHMSA was that they weren't doing the verification that they needed to ensure that PG&E was operating safely. There were too many times and too many missed opportunities where the regulator did not step in and say, this is what you committed to doing, this is what we expect you to do, or this data is not good, it needs to be improved. They need to take a hard stand, and I think when people violate the trust, the penalty needs to be high, because when we have an accident like San Bruno, it's too late.
The NTSB also called upon California state regulators, with assistance from PHMSA, to conduct a comprehensive audit of all aspects of PG&E's operations, including control room operations, emergency planning, record keeping, and performance-based risk and integrity management programs. The deadly pipeline rupture in San Bruno devastated an entire community. Its impact will be felt for years to come. A wake-up call for the pipeline industry, the tragedy reminds us all that deviations from safety standards, even something as seemingly minor as a single weak seam, can result in unthinkable destruction.